Welcome everyone to this lecture. Um, we are 1 week before Reading Week, and I hope everyone is energized. Um, the topic for today's lecture is, I'm guessing we're in familiar territory here. Um, I've called this lecture the passage, if you will, from hot war to the Cold War. And let me give you a breakdown of what material we will be engaging with and what we will be discussing in these segments and overall this week. How did the Second World War end? What were the foundations of post-war peace? Something important for you to bear in mind: the end of the Second World War marks the transition of political power from Europe to the two new superpowers, the USA and the USSR. How did this transition happen? What kind of mitigating factors occur? Then I will discuss the German question, because we need to bear in mind that Germany becomes one of these front lines of the new Cold War demarcations. We will explore further the geopolitical divisions that occur in the period that starts in the period that we conventionally call the Cold War. Then we will move on to from division to unity. We will discuss the foundations of the second international organization that we have in the 20th century, the UN. And finally, the final part of the third segment will focus on the coming of the atomic age, the nuclear bomb, and how that creates a new kind of balance in the world. Let me start now, and I will devote this segment to this first aspect, to just give you a sense of orientation in time and space, where we are in Europe as we transition from war to peace. With the end of the Second World War, Europe has suffered great destruction. 60 million casualties, 15 to 25 million were died in Russia alone. This is a staggering amount of death and destruction. 7 overall million slave laborers and camp survivors were displaced persons. And it is in the period that we have the emergence, or not quite the emergence, but the consolidation, as it were, of the status of the refugee and refugeedom. It starts after the First World War, but kind of the Second World War turns statelessness into a real problem. 50 million of migrants and refugees seek to return home. Some of them seek to return home, others emigrate. The destruction of Europe's Jewish populations, and not only, has led to a dramatic decrease of the presence of ethnic minorities in Eastern Europe. There is limited food production. The economic revival in Europe is relatively weak. However, life continues among the ruins, and it is there that I would like to go now and give you with a couple of different images from different parts of Europe, a kind of pictorial, as it were, overview of where we stand in the aftermath of the Second World War. London, right? Maybe these scenes are familiar to you. People sleeping in the tubes during the Blitzkrieg. Places are distracted, not distracted, excuse me. Distraction is seen across places. across the London's kind of urban hub. We can also see it when we walk around London. Indeed, there's Victorian houses, and next to it something that was certainly built after the Second World War. That points to the magnitude of destruction. And the UK is gradually picking up, trying to rebuild itself, and there is a very interesting shift in political power from the Conservatives to Labour, but that's something that you probably will discuss in another module. So this is the image from London. Dresden. Why Dresden? Dresden is a city in Germany that was pounded really hard by the Allies towards the end of the war, and in fact 80%, 90% of the city, it's not far from Berlin, was effectively became ruins. And these are images from the period. This goes on to show the magnitude of destruction in Germany itself as well towards the end of the war. Stalingrad, one of the bloodiest battlegrounds of the Second World War. Millions and millions of Russian soldiers died there. And again, ruins everywhere. From Stalingrad we go to Poland and Warsaw. Again, I believe that 80-90% of the city of Warsaw was totally devastated during the Second World War, especially towards the end of the Second World War. The city was evacuated, and if you have been or plan to go to Poland, it's very interesting to see how the whole city of Warsaw was in fact reconstructed from scratch during the Soviet period. Another image now, Paris. Remember what happens in France. In France, there is a government that collaborates with the Nazis. The resistance in France is pushed in southern France, not in Paris. Paris is held by the collaborators, the French collaborators of the Nazis. And Paris is one of these European cities that survives and is intact pretty much. This is an image from the day of the liberation of Paris, when General Charles de Gaulle, who has spent time in exile in London and also in the Middle East, is returning back with a fraction of the French army that survived to liberate the city. And the Paris story, that we don't have any ruins in Paris, is also something that, for instance, is being followed in places like Hungary and to some extent Prague. And here I invite you to bear in mind the fact that due to collaboration with the Nazis, certain cities that we find in Europe today that have a long history managed to somehow avoid being totally ruined. That is not to say that one ought to condone the collaborationist challenge, but I just merely note this. Other cities with equally historical, as Paris, for instance, like Warsaw in Poland, because they ended up being kind of in the front lines of this war, were distracted, were effectively brought into pieces. Anyway, that's a side note. I just hopefully now have given you a sense, traveling in different places, of how is Europe, how is different parts of Europe, how are different parts of Europe right in the end of the Second World War. The Allies were committed to the revival of democracy in Europe, and the path to democracy, in most cases, laid through conservative modernization projects. It's key here to keep in mind that the political forces in Europe in the mainstream, especially Western Europe, are the main political forces after the Second World War are conservative political forces. And conservative parties, especially in France, that's one case and not only, advanced family values. And obviously, West and East had different views of democracy. Some kind of liberal democracy started gradually gaining foothold in the western part of the continent, whereas in the eastern part, under the influence of the Soviets, forms of communist rule proliferated. And I should note here that territorial divisions also meant political and ideological divisions. And here I would like to draw from the case of Greece, just to show you how a place in the southern part of Europe ended up becoming one of the front lines of the new emerging geopolitical divisions. Picking it up from where I left it last week, if you remember, Greece witnessed, was occupied by the Nazis. There was, in most part of Greece, a collaborationist regime that effectively allowed the Nazis to rule by fiat. In the northern part of Greece, as I mentioned, the Nazi rule was more immediate, and that also led to the annihilation of Thessaloniki, the second biggest city of Greece's Jewish population. But the important thing to note here about Greece is that there is some kind of resistance that flees in the mountains of Greece, and this resistance is a red resistance. Socialists, people in Greeks in talks and in collaboration with the socialist camp, with the Russians, the Greek Communist Party, that's to say, undertakes resistance activities and forms a so-called provisional government in Greece. At the same time, the established conservative-leaning anti-Nazi Greek politicians are exiled in the Middle East, and they also represent the formal government of Greece in exile. So we have these two different units in Greece battling for influence, especially after the end of the Nazi rule. And many allies, and especially Britain, doesn't really wish to see Greece falling on the socialist camp if the socialist provisional government is to prevail. So I'm going to show you now two very interesting clips from the period just to see how the Cold War game pans out in Greece, just to get a glimpse of it.
As the German occupation of southern Greece begins to break up under the onslaught of British land forces and local partisans, ships of the Royal Navy and destroyers of the Greek Navy head shorewards through the waters of the Aegean. They carry large forces of troops to put an end to another chapter of Nazi tyranny and oppression. The dawn of liberation for Athens. Under cover of darkness, the warships had anchored off the Piraeus, and when light came, the troops entered harbor. Try to imagine the feelings of these people as they watch our men disembarking to bring freedom to the Greek capital.
So this is a very interesting clip because it kind of produces, the kind of core ideas of British propaganda. The British are disembarking in Greece. There's a power vacuum in Greece at the time. The Nazis have moved away. The Greek exiled government, the conservative government, is not yet in Greece, and the provisional socialist government is trying to get a grip of the situation. But the British are landing to Greece to ensure that there will be a transition to a government that will not be a socialist one. So that's how the documentaries of the time present the British mission to Athens and to Greece. And let's here see what happens a few months later.
One of the tragedies of the troubled situation in Athens has been the virtual stopping of supplies so sorely needed by the population. In the words of Mr. Churchill during his memorable speech at the all-party conference in the Greek capital, "We came with good hearts and full hands." But while the fratricidal strife between rival factions continues, work has now almost ceased on unloading our supply ships in the port of Piraeus. Meanwhile, in the city itself, men of a British airborne unit occupying a rooftop position fire down into the streets to prevent movement of Aevas forces. The ancient buildings hold sudden death, for the Greek warriors against whom General Scobie's forces have so regretfully had to take up arms learned guerrilla warfare in a hard school when they were fighting against their German oppressors.
The last forces that the documentary talks about is actually the forces of the Greek socialists who are trying to fill the power vacuum and occupy Athens and consolidate a communist regime in Greece. But the British, who understand themselves as liberators in the beginning, feel that there's too much at stake. So they join the fray and they actively try to prevent the socialists from taking up power in Greece. And this is the beginning of the Greek civil war that lasted for a few years and claimed many deaths and a fair bit of destruction. The civil war ended with the triumph of the royalist conservative forces with the help of the British. And this is, by the way, why in Greece, as in many other countries, Greece does not quite celebrate the end of the war, because the end of the Second World War provoked the beginning of the Civil War. And what I wanted to show you with these clips, and there will be links, and you can very easily find them. There will be links in the Moodle. You can see them at their entirety. I just wanted to show you how the new realities and the emergence of these two new antagonistic camps, the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union, created hardships on the ground in those places that ended up geopolitically being in the front lines of this new division of Europe. And a key moment that, in a way, it promises to stabilize the international situation is the Yalta Conference in February 1945. It's the Big Three agreement, where Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill carve out zones of influence based on percentages. Britain and the USSR were supposed to be 50-50 on Yugoslavia and Hungary. Russia would handle the affairs in Romania and Bulgaria, and Greece would fall on under British influence. This is something that the Greek socialists didn't quite know, that Russia had already signed off, as it were, retired from its support of the Greek socialist cause. There's also a joint declaration on liberated Europe, and there is this declaration and the stipulation that European post-war governments should be based on democratic institutions of people's own choice. Poland and small states between Russia and Germany are, in a way, sold out to Russia. And the third question of Germany is not really addressed at the Yalta Conference. And I will actually move on to Germany to start discussing the German question in the next segment. Now, what's interesting to note as well is that after the Second World War, when the Second World War ends, there is no one big peace or a conference like the Paris Peace Conference that ended the First World War, where everybody kind of comes together and negotiates various treaties. There are 5 smaller peace treaties. One, a treaty in Paris, where Allied powers signed peace treaties with the Nazi allies. There are temporary borders in Europe set by the Big Three. There is no formal treaty, however, to end the Second World War with Germany. There is no political regime on the other end to negotiate anything with. By 1947, the USSR and Britain cannot agree on terms of peace in Germany, and this is important. So the temporary arrangements on border and government, I'm talking about the German case here, become permanent. And another aspect of the peace that comes together, that builds after the Second World War, is how will the perpetrators pay for what they have done to Europe? And this is the subject of the Nuremberg trials, a series of military tribunals determining the fate of high-profile captured Nazis, those who didn't choose to kill themselves like Hitler and others. The courts have laid the ground for the development of international law regarding war crimes and crimes against humanity. And for the first time in international law, there is a clear and binding definition of genocide. There is a link before you move on to the next segment where you can see a bit more further in detail and see a little video on the Nuremberg trials. Now, when we come back, I will start discussing the German question, which seems to be a very central geopolitical frontier of the Cold War. Greece is another frontier, which is not quite in Central Europe, it's in Southern Europe.